Thank you, Samana. Greatly appreciated. And now we'd like to have a very special conversation with a very special human rights leader. We're going to be discussing today the state of affairs in Israel and Palestine with Michael Lynk, who many of you may know is not only an academic, a professor, but over the past 6 years has served as the Special Rapporteur for the United Nations on Israel-Palestine. We're very happy to have him here with us. Thank you so much for joining us, Mr. Lynk. How are you?
I'm fine, thanks. A great pleasure to be here.
Thank you, thank you. And Mr. Lynk is also a professor in Canada. He serves as an associate professor at the University of Western Ontario. But as I mentioned, over the past several years, he has had a very big job. And I'd like to ask him to tell us about his reflections on the work he's done in Israel-Palestine over the past several years as he prepares to depart his position, complete his term of service. Looking back, what are your thoughts? Challenges you faced, any progress you've seen, hopes for the future? Just give us your rear view look as you're preparing to switch up roles here.
Sure. I began this position 6 years ago in the beginning of May 2016. And I had, I guess, when I became Special Rapporteur, I had great hopes that the reports that I would write, the statements I would issue, the commentary that I would offer would play an influential role in persuading the international community to end its remarkable passivity towards Israel and the question of accountability. Israel has been many times named in UN resolutions at the Security Council, the General Assembly, and the Human Rights Council as being in violation of international law and of previous direction coming from the United Nations in terms of its occupation of the Palestinian territory. So I issued a number of reports where I pointed out the big gap between promise and performance, between what the UN and the international community had said Israel must be doing and what Israel was actually doing on the ground. And so as I began to look in the rearview mirror, as you've said, 6 years after having assumed this position, in the final few weeks of my mandate, I think I'm content with the work that I've done. I think I've been tough and bold with respect to my statements regarding both the role of Israel in human rights abuses in the occupied Palestinian territory and the role of the international community in giving, if you like, implicit permission for this occupation to continue. But I'm leaving deeply discouraged that the United Nations and the international community is so selective in what resolutions it's going to enforce and what resolutions it's going to withhold enforcement from. There are over 70 Security Council resolutions that have been adopted by the Security Council since the early 1970s regarding Israel's occupation. Virtually none of them have been put into place. And this is the primary reason why this occupation continues after 55 years.
Let me ask you this, Mr. Lynk. What were some of the challenges you faced in doing your work? This is not an easy position to be in. Anytime someone is commenting on human rights violations in this part of the world, they take some flack. Can you tell us more about some of the challenges you faced in this work and how you managed to overcome them?
Sure. There are two main challenges. First is that Israel did not allow me to enter into the occupied territories or to Israel. Each spring, I would write to the Israeli permanent mission in Geneva, asking for permission to be able to visit Israel and the occupied territories in my capacity as Special Rapporteur, and I got back with silence. Israel never gave a green light for me to go. It was criticized repeatedly at the Human Rights Council for its refusal to permit me to travel to the occupied territories. So what I did was go to Amman, Jordan, where UN officials in Palestine and human rights organizations in Palestine would come across the Jordan River and meet me and brief me in Amman. That's a second best plan, if you like, a plan B. It would have been wonderful to be able to go to the occupied Palestinian territories, to actually see the changes that are ongoing on the ground, and to be able to speak to those who are victims of human rights abuses directly. As it is, there is a very strong and vibrant community of human rights organizations, both in Israel and in Palestine, whose excellent reporting I have relied upon heavily over the last 6 years to be able to do my work. So I think my reports are well informed. I think my reports are insightful and do take account of the various human rights trends that have been going on there, but nothing would have substituted for the ability to actually go there. The second issue is just simply there are both Israel and a number of organizations that support the Israeli occupation are persistent critics of both my position as well as the United Nations in general. I've got to say, though, while I took those criticisms seriously in the beginning, I began to realize that there was no moral or illegal or political content to them. They weren't helping in terms of having an honest and informed exchange back and forth. Their differences were simply to be able to defend the occupation and criticize, or one might even use the word smear, those who were critical of Israel's occupation. So that didn't play an enormous role, I think, in the end on how I conducted myself as Special Rapporteur.
Understood. So you were, doing this work for 6 years, and in that time, you've noticed, and I'm sure observed some trends. It sounds like not going in the right direction. What would you say is the difference between the situation now in the occupied Palestinian territories compared to when you first started?
Virtually every major indicator, things have gotten worse. One primary indicator is the number of settlements and Israeli settlers living in the occupied Palestinian territory in East Jerusalem and the West Bank. When I became Special Rapporteur in 2016, there were approximately 380,000 or 390,000 settlers. Today, there are 480,000, and the settlement population is growing from between 20 to 25,000 settlers per year. It's hard to imagine how a two-state solution, a genuine two-state solution with a viable, contiguous, prosperous Palestinian state can emerge with that density of settlers living on their land. You look at any of the other main statistics, the degree of violence that Israel needs in order to be able to maintain the occupation is steadily increasing. 2021 was the highest number of deaths since 2014 of Palestinians killed by violence by Israel. 2021 was the highest number of settler violence directed towards Palestinians and towards their property since the statistics began to be first compiled around 2008. There is no peace process. There is no prospects for any peace process in the foreseeable future. So on virtually any indicator that you want to be able to look at, things have gotten worse. This is a more entrenched occupation than ever, which leads me to my last report, which I've just issued in March, where I said because of the structure and institutions that are there to ensure the domination and subjugation of one racial national group over another, this occupation has become indistinguishable from apartheid.
Well, that brings me to my next question, because we've seen Bethlehem, Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International reach the same conclusion that the crime of apartheid is being committed in this situation. And obviously, we've seen a lot of criticism of them, not based on the substance of what they said, as far as I can tell, just kind of vitriolic attacks on them. Can you go into a little bit of detail about why you concluded that essentially apartheid is being practiced against the Palestinian people?
Sure, very good question. When I began Special Rapporteur 6 years ago, I had kind of taken a silent vow to myself was I'm not going to use the term apartheid because I think it just chases away my ability to speak with diplomats, with political decision makers, and with the media about this. They see this word as being politically charged and explosive, and it winds up diverting the conversation about how to end the occupation and realize Palestinian self-determination. But I began to realize after about 4 years in this position that this occupation wasn't temporary, it wasn't indefinite, it was permanent. Israel was building its occupation not with wood as it's required to, but with concrete. And that a dominating structure with two different baskets of rights, substantial rights for the 700,000 Israeli settlers, Jewish settlers living in East Jerusalem and the West Bank, who had all of the rights, privileges, and benefits of Israeli citizenship, and then the living conditions of Palestinians living in Gaza, East Jerusalem, and the West Bank, where they had virtually no political rights, no recognized or enforceable international rights to wind up protecting them, where their land was being confiscated, where they were being barricaded behind walls and checkpoints. The vast difference between how Israeli Jewish settlers lived and how Palestinians lived in the same territory, in the same political space, led me to conclude that there is no other word or framework for understanding the situation but apartheid. If you can find a better term and a better framework for illustrating what is going on now in the occupied Palestinian territory, I'd welcome your suggestions or recommendations, but I cannot find a better word. I then began to read all of these Palestinian, Israeli, and international reports, well documented, well researched, dense in facts, very thoughtfully argued, and I was persuaded by them, which is what led me to be able to issue my final report 3 weeks ago to the Human Rights Council, where I have also concluded that, at least within the occupied Palestinian territory, this is apartheid. When you have two different groups, racial groups of peoples living in the same political and geographic space with two different dramatically different accesses to rights, there is really no other word or framework to be able to use. The poorest Israeli settlement and settlers have more rights and a better living condition than the richest Palestinian communities in the occupied territories.
So, Mr. Lynk, let me ask you this, and you may not be able to answer this, but all that being said, where do you think this is going? Because, when I think back to South Africa and the apartheid movement there, there was international pressure building on South Africa over time. There were some reasons why it seemed inevitable that that system just could not persist. But I don't know, do you see that? How do you see this ending? If everything you've said is accurate and the Israeli government shows no indication of changing course, there's not a significant international pressure outside of human rights groups, making these observations. For your successor in this role, if there is one, 6 years from now, where is this thing going?
I do have a successor. She was chosen 2 weeks ago by the Human Rights Council. She's a prominent Italian human rights lawyer who's lived in Jerusalem, who's written an excellent book on Palestinian refugees and international law. So she will be, I think, just a wonderful special rapporteur coming after me. In terms of where this is going, I have no good news to be able to report to you. Israeli leaders have publicly moved well past a two-state solution. The reality on the ground with these 300 settlements and 700,000 settlers has moved well beyond a two-state solution. The international community, certainly leading diplomatic and political decision makers, keep on repeating the mantra of a two-state solution. But a two-state solution, in my mind, has become a political unicorn. It's a form of time travel, because no one can explain, who defends the idea of a two-state solution anymore, how that's possible, given the Israeli facts on the ground. But Israel doesn't mind the international community continuing to use the term two-state solution, because it pretends as if it's still possible to create one, even as Israel thickens its presence in the occupied territories, to the point where a two-state solution is really putting in a blood transfer into a corpse. As long as the international community leads everybody to believe it's possible, when it's not anymore, Israel is in a good position. How does this end? You've cited South Africa, and the reasons why apartheid finally collapsed in South Africa were because of intense international pressure coming from civil society in throughout the world. It came from trade embargoes and sanctions against South Africa, and as well, because the Black South Africans rose up and created an unimaginable situation where the continuation of apartheid could not be managed by the white minority regime. I don't see any other way than following the South African path, unfortunately, for realizing Palestinian self-determination. It's going to have to be a vigorous and principled intervention by the international community, which will only come if civil societies in each of those countries wind up putting pressure on their governments to finally say, Israel, this is not a temporary occupation. Israel has every intention of making this permanent, and this has now become apartheid. It's going to also come with the Palestinian people themselves finding creative ways to make the occupation unmanageable. I hope it can be done through civil disobedience and peaceful resistance to the Israeli occupation. I fear that if that's not possible, or the world keeps on putting blockades to every attempt by the Palestinians to hold Israel accountable, then this is going to degenerate into a bloody violence between Israelis and Palestinians, which will make the creation of a new, prosperous, shared future between the two all that much more difficult.
Yeah. And in fact, we have seen some horrific violence happening on the ground there. I mean, it seems to always be happening, but especially the past few weeks, we've seen Palestinians being killed. Just a Palestinian lawyer was shot and killed yesterday. And there were attacks also in Israel, killing Israeli civilians. Can you briefly update us on what's happening on the ground right now, and why there's been this, I don't know, is this an uptick in violence, or is this just the latest in a long line of violence that's been occurring in the region?
Well, it's unfortunately a continuation of a long line of violence. I mean, the death rate or the death ratio between Palestinians killed by Israeli violence and Israelis killed by Palestinian violence is in the ratio of around 22 to 1. That's not saying that, and I'm not saying, I want to make sure that everybody knows this would be better if more Israelis were killed. I don't want anybody to be killed or dying, but Palestinians are paying in particular a horrendous cost in both in lives and in serious injuries as a result of the occupation. I repeat what I said before, is that the level of violence, in order for Israel to maintain the occupation, is trending higher and higher. So right now, over the past few weeks, there's been tension, in part because we have the coincidence of Ramadan and Passover occurring. There's great tension in East Jerusalem because of attempts by settler groups to remove Palestinians living in the homes they've been in for the last 70 some years in East Jerusalem, and taking these homes and these neighborhoods over for exclusive Jewish settlement. In Gaza, the economy is flat on its back, and virtually all the living indicators we would have about how life is there is getting worse. And land in the West Bank continues to be confiscated. Israel enables more Jewish outposts, new settlements to be created. And with, as I said at the beginning of our conversation, with 20 to 25,000 more settlers each year, the Palestinians are feeling abandoned. They see no hope with respect to a political process, and they probably, and many of them are critical of their own leadership for not having a viable, coherent strategy of how to end the occupation.
Professor Lynk, I want to thank you so much for sharing your perspectives, your experiences with us today. The first step towards fixing a problem is understanding a problem. And so I think your work over the past 6 years has shed a light on what is happening there. We appreciate you and your time today, and we look forward to communicating with you in the future, God willing. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for the interview.
Thank you, Professor. And Saman, we'll toss it back to you.